So we have a lot to unpack today about a pretty interesting report you just put out for the Heritage Foundation titled "Government Buildings in Africa Are a Likely Vector for Chinese Spying." Can you explain what this report is about?
So I've spent the last couple of years off and on collecting information on government buildings that Chinese companies have built in Africa. So the inspiration for the report came from a 2018 newspaper expose that a French media arm ran on the African Union headquarters, which is based in Addis, was built by a Chinese company that was being bugged by China. The ICT system, which was built by Huawei, a huge Chinese telecommunications firm, was uploading all of its information every morning to China, and there were microphones embedded in the walls, according to the report. So I started looking around the continent, seeing what other government buildings might be vulnerable to this sort of thing. I found 186 that I could confirm, but there are absolutely more. I know I wasn't able to find them, or I wasn't able to confirm mentions of those that I did find.
And why is this a problem for the United States? You mentioned the 186 buildings that were constructed by the Chinese, and I think you also mentioned in your report, the use of computers provided by the Chinese. So why is this an issue for the United States?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of major problems here for the United States and for many other countries, actually, but we're talking about the US here. So first, these buildings are part of a Chinese influence campaign that they've been waging on the continent for decades now, with a lot of success. So African countries are among China's strongest supporters on the international stage. China is getting much more aggressive internationally, pushing its agenda, and those African states are coming right along with China. I'll give you just a couple examples. The African countries, many have been supportive of China's expansionist claims in the South China Seas, which is obviously something the US resists very firmly, as do many other countries. African countries, by and large, very supportive. And even in this current pandemic, when the Trump administration questioned the credulous and overly respectful approach that the WHO had been taking with China and questioned the leader of the WHO's leadership, African states scrambled to defend the head of the WHO. So this is going to make it very hard for the US to hold China accountable for its botched handling of the pandemic, because it'll need some international support to do that. African countries are probably going to side with China on this. And then just quickly, the other two reasons I'd throw out there. One, senior US officials spend a lot of time in these buildings talking with African counterparts. So if they're bugged, that obviously is problematic for any American official who wants to keep or wants to have a sensitive conversation remain secret. And then two, American companies are increasingly involved on the continent, especially tech companies, very, very interested in Africa. And tech companies are a persistent source of or target of espionage attacks by the Chinese. So if there's a company representative in one of these buildings talking about bids or business processes or technology, that could all be vulnerable to Chinese exploitation.
As China continues to move forward with its Made in China 2025 initiative, how does the use of surveillance contribute to their goal of world dominance in just 5 years?
Yeah, I think it does in a variety of ways, some of which we've just touched on. Again, I think the danger of them picking up some sensitive information about technology or, again, business processes from some of our flagship companies is very real. And obviously, China has a long history of doing this. It's a central part of their economic model is to steal as much intellectual property and technology as possible. It's part of what has fueled their rise. So we need to really be vigilant about that. And then the other element here is that, again, as Chinese companies expand on the continent, some of these are tech companies. We already know about Huawei and ZTE. But there are AI companies like CloudWalk, for instance, that use their technology back in places like Xinjiang, which is one of the heavily repressed regions of China. So there's a real fear that they could be using and perfecting surveillance technology, hoovering up information to feed their AI programs to perfect what they're doing in the repressive actions they're doing in China itself.
You mentioned tech companies before as being impacted by Chinese influence throughout Africa. Are there other businesses that this surveillance and spying poses issues for in Africa?
Yeah, I think certainly any company that handles technology China might be interested in is immediately at risk. But two, any company that is competing with a Chinese company is also at risk because China does a lot of business on the continent. It has a lot of its very large state-owned enterprises active on the continent, and they compete with American companies. It's well documented that the Chinese government shuffles information that it collects through espionage and surveillance to its companies to advantage them. So again, if you're a Chinese company competing with an American company for a contract, and suddenly the Chinese government hands you information about your competitor's bid, that's a huge advantage.
I want to talk now about those countries that are susceptible to surveillance by the Chinese Communist Party. Why is that a problem for them?
It is I think the primary reason is because of this influence campaign that we've been talking about. So if you're surveilling one of these government buildings, you're spending a lot of time observing Afghan leaders, obviously, and you can pick up a lot of valuable information about their habits, their predilections. You might learn about their financial situation, all of these things that can help you manipulate these leaders or even blackmail them on some level, or even I bring this up in the report, even recruit them as an asset, as an intelligence asset. There's a host of problems here, and it sounds a bit conspiratorial and tin-hatted, but this is the way the world works frequently. It can be a really shady, underhanded business. So that's one problem for the African governments. Another I point out in the report is that there is a nascent technology scene in Africa, and they are developing some really interesting technologies. Those are going to be at risk if the Chinese government is interested in them at all. It would be very easy for them to pick them off, so to speak, and steal that intellectual property.
And just to wrap up the interview, with all the information that you provided today and in your report, what steps can U.S. officials take, government officials take, and other countries that want to stop China from, potential surveillance?
Yeah, as I say in the report, there's nothing we can really do in the short term to fully protect ourselves from Chinese surveillance in Africa. It's just not happening. They're too fully embedded, and in fact, they'll always have some sort of surveillance presence in Africa as long as they're interested in the continent. That's just the reality. More fully pushing back on Chinese influence that is detrimental to American interests on the continent will require a very broad, holistic strategy that unfortunately the U.S. does not appear to have right now. But for sort of concrete steps that we can do about this specific problem, yeah, I think there's a couple. One, just awareness is a huge part of this. The report has been met with a lot of interest in a lot of circles, and I'm surprised, frankly, that more people haven't been thinking about this issue and aware of the potential for this problem. So that alone is a big step, I think, is making people aware. I think the U.S. government needs to train its people who go to Africa on the risks involved with surveillance. I think it needs to brief American companies that work there. And then there needs to be some sort of effort to come up with countermeasures. Again, we're not going to fully protect ourselves on the continent. That's just the reality of Africa and of the world. But there are some things, I'm sure, that are very bright people in the intelligence community can figure out to do to mitigate the downside risks here.